Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm on my International Booker Prize nonsense. And here is the another book from the shortlist, Standing Heavy by GauZ and translated by Wynne. And this book I'm going to be talking about with some light spoilers. It's in some ways not a big spoilery kind of book in the same way, mostly because it's split into different parts, but I'll try to avoid those as much as I can, at least for this early section. So let's get started. This is a book that largely focuses on three different time periods, and particularly is focused on really examining immigration and integration and various other things in France over these different time periods. So, for example, we have a character in the 60s coming from the Côte d'Ivoire who is really convinced that this is going to be his moment. He's going to move to France. He is going to have this wonderful, rich life. He's going to, really make his mark on the world. We then have another set of characters really in the 90s who are coming to France during this really interesting period and are also convinced that they're going to be making so much money that they're going to be able to send loads home, that they're going to be able to really provide for their families. They're going to be these big successful people, kind of, very much the streets are paved with gold kind of narrative almost. And all of this is really grounded by the central kind of pivot of this book. A pivot is not the word, central sort of point that we keep coming back to, which is a security guard. And this is also where the title of the book comes from. So standing heavy being a sort of slang term used to describe somebody who is a security guard, because you are standing, you are a heavy there in the room, and you're kind of, that's who you are. And actually I really like how this book approaches sort of how we view the narrative. So having these three time periods, I think already was a really interesting move. And what I really like about how it plays out is that these three time periods, particularly the first two, are so full of hope, this idea that everything's going to change. And we keep coming back to this security guard, who even starts the book as well, at realizing that things have not changed massively and things are still rough for certain groups of people. The security guard himself is in this very strange position where he is waiting for his residency permit to sort of become fully French in that sense, despite having lived in France for, I think, 7 years, I think at that point. So he is not, he's doing a really important job, and people sometimes, seem to give him respect for doing it, although it's also a job that's often maligned. But he is not given the sort of the benefit of the state to sort of say you're really here, and all of that sort of offsets him as this really interesting, sets him up. I can't do phrases today. Really, really interestingly sets him up as this pivotal figure in the book who is watching the world go by. And actually, in the author notes at the end, we find out that GauZ, the author, was actually a security guard. So this is sort of coming from some experience. But the security guard bits are done in these very small vignettes, sometimes a couple of sentences long, talking about things he's observed, often very funny, very biting, very satirical. And all of that really points towards what he is seeing around him. And what he's seeing around him is often really intriguing, because sometimes he is watching how certain groups are really criminalized and marginalized. So people from North Africa and the Middle East, particularly, are seen as troublemakers, by kind of other security forces. And so he is there to sort of make sure that people aren't stealing things, but also sometimes sees people who look like him, and the only real difference is that he's wearing a uniform and has been told to sort of guard this shop or whatever, and he's doing this all in a Sephora shop in a mall in the Champs-Elysees. So he is he's in this really iconically French and Parisian location, and this sort of center of France is this sort of cultural sort of icon or whatever. And he is doing a sort of a slightly more mundane job, I guess, for want of a better word. And he is making sure people don't steal. And so he has these really interesting observations, because he will say, you know, he'll note, for example, that that, you know, a white woman who is affluent, who walks through in a certain way, will not be troubled by security guards, because it's assumed that she will not steal. And all of those feed into a wider narrative of, you know, actually, you know, he at one point makes a sort of joke about how, like, apparently, you know, like, there's sort of almost this tale he's heard that the further out from Paris you go, the lighter skinned the security guards get, until you get to an area of France where there are actually white security guards. And for him, this is sort of mind blowing, because, you know, almost every security guard in the area he works in is black or a person of color in some form. And so for him, he he talks about how, you know, there's a reassurance in people's eyes when they see a black man guarding this shop, because there's a sort of perceived sort of masculinity or strength or physicality that makes people feel a little bit more secure. Whereas actually, if he were out of the uniform, people might perceive him a certain way and might treat him differently. So actually, the uniform is the thing that's sort of protecting him from wider racism and wider sort of persecution. The uniform is the thing that makes him palatable in the eyes of white France. And so it's this really interesting dynamic. And often those are really funny observations. He will sort of spot someone and talk about how he sees the opening line is about is about these sort of really funny observations around babies and shoplifting and so many other things. It's great in that sense. And actually, it's interesting. The security guard bits, I think the book without them doesn't really work. I think a book of just the security guard bits would have been quite tricky. Because I think it would have felt a bit repetitive, but actually it's broken up by these narratives of actually the context that goes into this. So these people who, you know, over a span of many years have been trying to make a life for themselves in France, and sometimes they've succeeded, sometimes they've failed, but ultimately they are there in France, and the way that France then deals with them is a wider conversation and needs to be had about, you know, actually what can we do to make life much better for people who have risked everything to move and to come over and to start a new life. So this book, I think, really engages with so many big political issues in a really funny, satirical, biting way. And for such a short book, I really found that it packed a real punch. I'm not going to try and go into a spoiler-free section, because actually really the experience of the book is not really one of plot in the same way. And I don't mean that as a negative thing about this book. I think it has a really interesting story to tell, but it's not a kind of thing of, ooh, this thing happens in the plot that we need to talk about. It's more about how this book structures that conversation and thinks about the conversation that we have around, essentially around including people who have come to the country, and what that looks like. He really zeroes in on some really difficult topics, and I think explodes them in this really funny and interesting and clever way. And so I think it's a good inclusion on the list, and I'm really glad I read it. I think it's a really interesting gem of a book on this list. I'm intrigued to hear other people's thoughts.